how does Silicon Valley compete with something that's given away free with something that Silicon Valley charges for?
You get rid of all of that critical metal issue about building new data centers because the top data centers we have are state of the art. Now, the Chinese can't get their hands on that at the moment. It becomes very hard for the Chinese to keep up with. If the Chinese have an advantage on critical metals now, they might as well play those cards.
We not have somewhat of an advantage now with oil?
You're watching the Financial Sense News Hour. Financial news for high net worth investors and strategists. When it comes to the biggest investment trends and understanding the market, we've been delivering the insights you need for over 30 years.
Well, China just came out with a new AI model and it's rattling Silicon Valley. And that's the topic of today's podcast. Joining me is Craig Tindale. Craig, everyone has been framing this AI race as a race for compute. But your articles, you often frequently talk about this isn't about compute. It's really a race for stuff. Explain that.
I guess we go right back 1972, I think it was. What was the thing called? The limits to growth. It was written in 72 and they said in 2025 we'd start running out of stuff. And a lot of us discounted that and thought we'd innovate around it and it sounded too simple. But it's funny how it's emerged right at the moment. And we've got surging demand from a number of areas, electrification, from AI, I guess decarbonisation is from the earlier administration, and so we've got a surge of demand in all the critical metals, and all the rare earths. The rare earths have come out of nowhere. Everybody's fond of saying rare earths aren't that rare, and they aren't, but they were rare for us to want to use. If you look at scandium, for instance, we're using about 60 tonne a year. It's not a lot for a global marketplace. Gallium is not much different. We used to give gallium away, and we still do in many cases, as a derivative product from aluminium smelting, from the bauxite to aluminium process. And the Chinese get the bauxite and take the gallium from that and get it for free. I wrote an article on that showed there was about $200 billion over 10 years of derivative metals being taken out of stuff that we didn't care about. And the reason we didn't care about it was kind of common sense. And the common sense is that we weren't using that much of it. And so it wasn't important. And now all of a sudden it's become important. And, I've got a couple of illustrations. We've got a lot of illustrations of that. But, scandium, for instance, when you put it in aluminium, reinforces airframes. So if you want to build drones that fly at, 20 and 30 G rather than the 9 or 8 or 9 G that an F-35 goes at, you've got to need lots of scandium. The same with gallium. You can go through a kind of demand story for each one.
That brings me to a question. If you were to name one key mineral for AI, what would the number one be?
Geez, that's a tough one. I think it'd probably be gallium. There's a whole bunch actually. You could make justifiable, and chemicals as well. Let's not forget things like magnesium and things like that. But gallium, I think, is important at the center of everything because it helps manage electrification. And if you look at NVIDIA and the AMD, they roughly, with every release of a chip, they roughly double the gallium that's in it. So you've got this exponential demand curve for gallium, but it also, I call them gallium guns, but they're concentrated energy weapons. They knock missiles and drones out of the sky as soon as you send a pulse of electricity at them, and that's going to be important in the new wave of defense. But they're all important, and so let me go through with what is actually happening, because I think that tells us a slightly different story than we're thinking about. When we originally built these AI data centers, they had significance. I guess industrial metabolism. 50,000 tons of copper, 9 tons of silver. There's a list, and it was obvious we were going to run out of stuff if we kept building them at that rate. And then through Colossus 1 and later Colossus 2 that's getting finished now, Elon kind of turned the whole game. And he built a data center that refreshed chips instead of building new data centers. So, we know the Michael Burry argument that we retire chips at a rate of every 3 or 4 years or something like that. And some of the accounting that he was accusing NVIDIA of was 5 or 6 years. Let me introduce in a constrained atmosphere, in a situation where you can't get the copper to build new data centers, you refresh the chips, every 6 or 12 months. Each version of this chip, if you look at Rubin, for instance, and the next NVIDIA chip, it's got like 4 versions that come in interversion inside it. And so what you end up is, because of constraints on the materiality of building these data centers, especially the electrification, we know the electrification can take a long time. Siemens at the moment are on 5 or 6 years for a transformer. So is Mitsubishi, so is Hitachi. If you're on constraints that multiply out, because we know that there's constraints on the energy sources and the gas-fired turbines and things like that, you have to innovate inside the pocket. And inside the pocket means that you've got to be able to swap out these chips and refresh them way faster than anyone has ever contemplated. And that's what Colossus 2 has been set up to do. It's been set up so he doesn't have to wind out the racks and pull out the everything every time that a new chip comes out. He can just wind the new ones in, and they can either retire, or they can redeploy, or they can recycle. And I think recycling is going to come into it in a big way. So that your AI, I guess, let's call it IQ. IQ is an imperfect measure of AI, but I think it does the job for this discussion from a kind of conceptual sense. What's going to happen is you're going to end up with way more IQ for every watt of power. You're going to innovate inside that pocket, so that, I've been looking at extrapolating some of the improvements they're making, both at an algo level and a hardware level that are coming through on the NVIDIA chips and the AMD chips. And you could, at the moment, you've got, I think the Chinese one came out at 2.8 trillion attributes. You've got in 3 or 4 years, you could have models that come out with 100 trillion attributes. And very, hundreds of times smarter than they are now. If we were to compare it to IQ, it could be 140 IQ now, or 160 or 170. We could argue about that, but we're talking about an IQ of 2,000 in 3 years. And we're talking about inside the same data center that it was. So you get rid of all of that critical metal issue about building new data centers, because the top data centers we have are state of the art. Now, the Chinese can't get their hands on that at the moment anyway. The Chinese can't get their hands on you go from the H100 chips to the 200 to the 300 to the Rubin to the Ultra Rubin, and to the NASM. They're stuck at the H100s.
I'm going to come to what you just said about their new moonshot program, which is 2.8 trillion attributes. Craig, they're giving this stuff away free. How does Silicon Valley compete with something that's given away free with something that Silicon Valley charges for? In other words, how does charging compete with free?
Well, I think Alex Karp came out with it the other day, and he got a lot more support than you got a lot of criticism in the media, but you got a lot of support also. Is that the paying customers want security? Are they going to buy a Chinese AI engine that could have anything embedded in it? At the moment, they're offering that AI engine as a shared engine, we can use that. But I can't see American corporations or Western corporations using it on anything but on premise. And the on premise, just to build the smallest version of this Chinese version, is $300,000 a month in Amazon charges for the server and all the other constituent parts. So it's not exactly an easy model to use yet. And it's not like, if you look at it in a classic product sense, how does the product take off? How does it get uptake? Where's the market? Who are the market payers? Who are going to pay for it? Which CIO is going to say, yeah, let's go with the Chinese model out of 99 out of 100 Australian or American or European companies? I don't see it happen. Government certainly won't do it. I think that'd be super controversial. So I think what we're going to have is just an era where they're gazumped every week, and we get distracted all the time by saying, okay, they're ahead on this one, they're behind on that one. I think Elon's purchase of Cursor is instructive. $40 billion worth of script. It didn't cost him much. He just had to give him paper for it. And that can easily be turned into a million virtual programmers inside the improvement engine, or the algo improvement engine of each release of AI. It's interesting that both Gemini and Anthropic have gone to Elon for compute, because he's building the best compute. And so there's a point where this hardware, let's call it might be that spruce goose that Hughes had, or it might be a much bigger plane that actually gets off the ground. If this hardware division, if this separation, which means that we can't ship the chips to the US, to China, continues, then the American AI gets off the ground faster than the Chinese one. And then I reverse it back. I think to myself, well, if the Chinese have an advantage on critical metals now, they might as well play those cards. And so that's why I think there's a quickening. Because the Chinese either have to use it or lose it. And they've got advantage at the moment from a critical metals perspective. So you wouldn't see why they wouldn't accelerate that advantage or lose it.
I want to move away from this for a minute and talk about the war with Iran. There's a lot of questions that the U.S. may be running out of key missiles and munitions, and we're heavily dependent on the Chinese for like magnets and things like that. So take us through the strategic minerals that we use in war platforms and machines. And in addition to that, warfare is changing right now. We've seen that with the use of drones, and especially with what Ukraine is doing to Russia. So I guess, could you name, as an example, one weapon system and trace the minerals that we depend on to build it?
Well, yeah, I guess I started off with gallium before. Gallium is central to all the new weapons. It's central. Scandium is central to all the new weapons too. The new drones that Palmer Luckey come out with, Anduril came out with, all have G factors that are way above their accompanying planes. So you can put used to put 12 planes out for a squadron or something like that, 12 to 24. Now you can put one plane out and 50 or 60 drones that surround it. We don't know exactly what the configurations are, but that's central to the future. It used to be just the central rare metal was anatomy, which was the percussion instrument of a shell, etc. But it goes right across all of the rare earths now. And so, I wouldn't be surprised. We've all known that the Achilles heel for US, I guess, war is the ability for it to supply the correct amount of artillery, or to ordnance, and that's limited at the moment. It has to be limited, and it looks like the Iranians want to rope-a-dope this out, just to take the punches and wear the US out, which is a classic, military siege point of view. Is wear out the siege, by just denial, by the fact that they can deny both straits now and both accesses to the Middle East as far as petrochemicals. But on the other side, you've got other things, like 50% of the world's helium came from UAE. You've got NAPFA, you've got BTX, you've got a whole bunch of other stuff that's starting to bite the Chinese as well. I think what we do is get a little carried away with what's happening now compared to what might happen in 3 months, where the shortages, I think, will occur right across both economies, including, even though they've managed really well to reduce their usage, including the Chinese. The best numbers I've got from people who know more about the oil business than me is that they start hurting September or so, and that's not far away anymore. The naphtha crackers right through Asia are kind of silent. The Chinese were importing, I think 11 million tons worth of it, and they're not getting any of it. And there's a lot of stuff that's being shipped by the Americans as well. So we come down to this kind of negotiation duel that I think is happening in October or September. It'll probably happen right through the last few months of the year, where this agreement, this licensing agreement that the Chinese and Americans agreed to, I think it was back middle last year, comes for renewal. And what gets renewed is highly dependent. The Americans are trying to choke the Chinese, and the Chinese are trying to choke the Americans. And I don't think it's that much more complex. America, for instance, has increased ethane exports to China by 300%. And that was a small part of the agreement that happened in London back middle last year. So you've got a whole bunch of chokeholds, and I don't think, do we have the hierarchy of intelligence? Are we at the right level to understand which one's biting and which one's not, and which ones we can't see? That's I sit here and try and work out which ones I can't see all the time, and I'm constantly surprised by things I find, and I think what happens is you'll see, I think, the Americans trying to extend this out. But Iran looks terrible to me. To come back on your point, Iran looks like something that they're stuck in, that they, it's the short war complex. Putin did it in Ukraine. He thought he was going to get in and out of there in a couple of weeks or a couple of months or whatever he thought. I think Trump was convinced he could get in and out of Iran in a couple of months. And, wars are sticky. And that's what happened it's arguably what happened in Vietnam as well. I think the incentives are for Trump to push harder, because I don't think he can push lighter. I think he's compelled forward. It's like a finger trap in some respects. That's not to say that the Iranians won't topple. This assumption that they can take any amount of rope-a-doping and they can get hit hard and constantly, and they'll never give in. That may be a suspect assumption too. None of us know. If they kill enough of the senior leaders, none of us are sure what's really going to happen. They've done well already. We've done well so far not to fall apart, but does that continue? Can Iran continue with all the bridges and roads being knocked out? Do you end up with some kind of internal fragment? I've got a lot of contacts in Iran, and I've got a lot of contacts who have contacts in Iran, and they tell me that stuff has been flowing over the border from Turkey since the start of this. Now, is that being curtailed with these bridge hits? I'm not sure.
Well, the U.S. is sort of waking up. We're talking about reindustrialization. You have the U.S. getting involved in key material companies, rare earth companies. Um, is it too late, or do you think there's a chance here? I guess if you were to name and describe the West as, I think you've said the turtle on its back, and you look at going forward for people to take this seriously, politicians, investors, professionals, even parents, how does one reason with this?
Um, I think it's hard. I think we just have to. I think I've said over and over in a lot of my posts and social media comments is that we should be really careful of people predicting certainty, because if you go into if you're a scholar of war history and you're a scholar of these kind of geopolitical events, you never know what's going to happen next. After Pearl Harbor, it probably looked pretty dire for the US. Um, we the US, I think, has the ability to probably have a jab that pokes the Chinese away for a long, long time. And may do it through catastrophe. Who knows? Um, the the reality, though, is it takes. We all know this. We all know this intuitively. It takes a lot longer to start the truck up than let the truck, stop. It's got to be repaired. It's got to be rebuilt. You've got to get people trained. You haven't got the skills. You've got to import skills. You've got to do all kinds of things to get the industrial metabolism back up to speed. Now, I don't think it's as bad as it is in Europe, for instance, or something like that. Colossus 2 is being built down in Missouri. These things are being built. That you've got a lot of fabs being built. Hitachi's building a transformer factory. You've just had announced from 2023, when the startup started, that a nuclear power plant was built by one company from 2023 to 2026. You've got a lot of stuff rolling. It's just the US has to keep this jab going, to keep from expiring along the way. I think it's going to be quite difficult. But you have got the AI coming. If they can keep that lead, to me, going back to your original point, this Chinese thing is a distraction. We're going to have maybe 50 announcements over the next 10 years about who's leading, maybe. And we'll go, oh my God, we've lost again. And also ask yourself the question, what does it mean to win or lose? Right? Is China going to be denied AI? I doubt it. Is America going to be denied AI? I doubt it. Is any of the West going to be denied? No one's going to be denied it. Right? So it's about who runs through the tape, who runs past the post the first, and there's some kind of prize or something that we imagine that's going to happen. But when I think we've properly examined that abstract assumption, it actually doesn't mean anything. We all get AI, and all AI becomes prevalent in all our societies. And I don't think the winner or loser frame tells us everything we need to know, or anything really. We may lose AI and still survive as the West quite well, or we might win AI and lose economically. I don't think it's a result in itself. And that's why I think it's distracting.
It was amazing when I was doing research. I didn't realize the US has, I think, over 5,000 data centers. I think China's got a little over 500. But the one thing that China has that we don't have, they're building, I think the figure was 39 nuclear plants under construction, a hydroelectric dam, and then I think it's like 50 plus coal plants. I can't think of, at least at the moment, any nuclear power plant that's under construction. Can you?
Yeah, well, they built this one, Anatomus, I think it is. I've posted about it. I'll give you a link after this. But there's one in the US that was built in 3 years, and it's already in fusion stage. So you've got startups. It's happening. you know, that it'll probably take another 2 years to be on full power and to be providing power. But there's lots of innovation happening. What worries me is there's innovation up the high end for data centers and maybe energy and things like that. But what about that middle end? You know, the other manufacturing that gives you the skills to supply those supply chains. You know, I don't see that moving quite as well. But you know, I think what our culture does is frame things in disaster and black and white, and you know, I don't think we can see the future, and I think it's kind of like its own adaptation made of grey and all kinds of other colors. You know, American exceptionalism might come through, but you know, they don't. The America of tomorrow, you can see it politically already happening. The America of tomorrow is not going to be the same America that has been the last 20 years. And like I say to my friends, and you'll be the same. The America I grew up, the Australia I grew up in, the America you grew up in, is already gone. It's gone. It's completely vanished. You know, we don't live in that world anymore. You know, I remember sitting around the table with a whole bunch of World War II veterans in my family. You know, we had when you have Memorial Day, we have Anzac Day. I remember the only people went out to Memorial and Anzac Day in Australia, I don't know if it's the same in America, was the people that actually fought. And it was a different type of day. So I think our culture has changed a lot anyway, and I think it's going to change a lot. And I think we've got elements in our culture. You know, there's a lot of pushback on this, on changing our culture. You know, in the US, it's the conservative parties. In Australia, it's the conservative parties too. But some of that culture will change, whether we like it or not. You know, you can see it with the crazy New York mayor. Like that's crazy. Could any of us believed after 9/11 that you would have a mayor like that, you know, 25 years later or whatever it is? You know, it's crazy. So change will happen, and we'll come up with I go back to this extrapolation of intelligence that's going to happen. You know, we're watching AI at the moment, and we're amazed by AI, and it's about 5% as strong as intense as it's going to be in 3 years, not 10 years, not 20 years, not in 3 years. It's going to be 20 times more intelligent. I don't, and the way it's, you know, Elon was talking about the other day. He said, I don't even think people in AI understand how quickly this is going to move. The watts used per element of IQ, let's call it, is going to extrapolate at 10 times a year. That's 1,000% a year. Like, we've all done the chessboard thing where you double a cent every time it goes, you know, past a chess piece, and you end up with millions at the end, right? This is doubling and this is going up by 1,000% in 1 year, and then the year after, and the year after, and the year after. You know, when Jensen talks about his new releases, not a lot of people listen. They go, oh, yeah, that's just the new model. It's like, you know, the old days where, you know, a new chip had come out. But he's talking about extrapolating the speed and the information that's going through those chips by, you know, 1,000% a year. So we haven't encountered what we're about to encounter yet, and we think we have.
Well, just take a look at the internet when it first came out. Take a look at how that changed commerce. Take a look at the Amazon today, and take a look. Everybody has a website and how marketing is done. So I can only imagine what outcome that we're going to see with AI as it progresses over the next couple of years.
And you'll see the politics change, because there'll be a, you know, what about us kind of movement, a humanist movement will say, a friend of mine, Michael Every, says, what is GDP for? You know, he always asks the question, what's GDP for? what's an economy for? And we've got to ask the question: what are we doing this for ourselves? It might not affect you or me whether humans become obsolete in a lot of roles, but it's going to affect a lot of humans, and those humans are going to talk about it and become semi-crazed like the people in New York. And that's going to happen. If you look at what Dario said, I think it's completely, Dario from Anthropic and those leaders that keep telling us there'll be no accountants in 12 months or whatever. It's crazy that they're spruiking the idea that they're making humans obsolete, and that's going to have a political reaction. And we should just accept that's going to have a political reaction. If it's true, and I have some questions about whether it is, but if it's true, there's going to be a lot of pushback, and we're going to watch a lot of pushback. The elections coming up are going to be the most interesting part. Trump's speech the other day, I think, it's just not been listened to properly.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. Craig, if you were to get to, let's say, the end of this decade, what would be the signs that tell you the West finally understood it in the nick of time, and one that would tell you we didn't?
I think if we get to the end of this decade and we're not a long way to a circular economy, like we can't afford to dig up 5 extra copper mines a year and all this kind of stuff. We have to work out within our means. I think that's going to be the evolutionary impulse in this, that we're going to be restricted, like limits to growth told us that it's going to arrive in a different way than we thought that it would, and that we'll have to innovate inside that pocket. And so if we get to the end of the decade and we're recycling all our old chips, we're recycling all our e-waste, we're maybe recycling our coal waste and our what they call mud to metals, the red mud that comes from aluminium smelting. If we're doing that kind of thing, I think we've woken up. And I can see a lot of that stuff beginning to happen. I don't know if they'll follow through with it, but you've got like, if you can't get the minerals, you have to use what you've got, and those minerals already exist in your environment. Coal waste, for instance, has coal dust, especially in some types of coal dust. There's 2 billion tons of it in the US market at the moment that's just been dumped. That can be reprocessed. There's been nearly $600 million worth of grants given out in the last 6 months to work out how to do that. There's 5 or 6 companies been awarded contracts to do it. Red mud, you've got the US State Department negotiating with Alcoa over here to get the gallium out of the red mud that go in the Australian bauxite mines. Australians mine almost more bauxite than anywhere in the world. You've got that happening in Rio Tinto in Quebec as well. So you've got, like, if I was just to lay all this out, and I will lay it out, there's a lot of initiatives happening behind the scenes that haven't really been stitched together. So there is hope. It's not like there's nothing happening. For instance, most of the the Rio Tinto one in Quebec as well is being put together by, what's the company? It's I can't remember the company's name, but there's significant efforts to start harvesting some of these derivative metals out of existing mine ore bodies that are being shipped to the to China before they're shipped to China. Now, whether that gets fixed in time, I don't know. I think the demand side is way too much for it to be fixed traditionally. So I think that's why they start to work out how to recycle things. You did that in World War II, by the way.
Final question, if I may, Craig. What would you absolutely be doing right now?
I would be doing the recycling path and the mine waste path and that path. I would be assuming that you're going to get cut off and there's going to be restrictions. I I would just be doing everything they're doing, but faster. I don't think you can accelerate, because what happens is you end up with a use it or lose it situation from the Chinese side. They've got advantage at the moment, so that motivates them to push to prosecute that advantage. And so I think that's the danger of this next 6 to 12 months, is that they have advantage on us, and then they push that advantage, and it becomes quite difficult.
Do we not have somewhat of an advantage now with oil? I mean, if you think about, where our Navy is in the Gulf in Venezuela, they have rare earths, we have oil.
I think you do. I think you do petrochemicals as well. I think they're underrated. Reagents are underrated. I think what everyone's missing here. I wrote a paper about the 12 degrees of consequences of Hormuz when it first happened. I think what people are missing here is we're in month 3 or month 4 or whatever it is. There's things that happen at month 6 and month 12, and as we get further into this, we start to break and become more brittle, and we haven't waited out that time yet. So a lot of people think, well, there's not that much happened yet. I think what's oil this morning at 110?
Yeah, Brent was over 100, and WTI was over 90.
Yeah, and I think now with this other constriction, this other chokehold that they've got on the Gulf, we start to see real numbers maybe come out. I don't think the market is really valuing the risk that's involved here. But I do think there is a chokehold. I think there's a chokehold on both sides. I think if I was to rate it, I'd rate it kind of equal at the moment. Right. And I think what happens with pundits is they get too carried away in the moment, and they don't realize that there's fuses. There were 100 fuses set off 3 or 4 months ago, and we can only see about 3 or 4 of the fuses at the moment. The rest of the fuses are still burning, and I think they're consequential to as much to China. Like, you just have to see what's happening in Russia. Russia won't have any energy left. They were reported as importing energy from India the other day. What happens if and why is Russia being so soft about it? Why are they continuing? Why is Iran continuing? Is there another foot to drop? Because Iran seems very determined, and Russia seems very determined, and Russia's suffered some major losses, and so have the Iranians. Is there some element that we haven't seen yet? This is a great game.
All right. Well, listen, Craig, as we close, how can our listeners follow you? You're on Substack, you're on X, you have a website. So tell them how they can find more about you and your articles.
Just on those two, just on Substack, on X. I write every day. I've been a bit slow the last few weeks because I've had the flu, and I'm here to talk to Jim anytime he wants me to.
Okay. Well, we were talking before we went on the air. You're working on an article covering some of the stuff that we were covering in this interview, and that's going to be what, in the next couple of days?
It'll be next couple of days. It'll deal with mostly the issues with respect to AI, China versus US. I think, and it'll be framing everything a little bit in a longer time frame. We get carried away with headlines and 2.8 trillion parameters and all those kind of things. And I think what unfolds here is a quickening of intelligence per watt that will just blow our minds, and it'll be hard for the Chinese to catch up unless they can break the blockade of chips, unless they can get the chips as well. Because at the end of the day, they can't. They can work out fancy ways to make their system run, just as well as the Western ones, or they can steal it depending on who you listen to. But they can't outrun the physics of the chip technology eventually, if the blockade holds. So eventually the US leads this if everything else holds. because they're going to swap those chips in. Like you got in just the Rubin range, you've got Vera Rubin, you've got the main. There's a Rubin qubits or something like that. There's about 4 or 5 of them that come in. That if you refresh all the time through a data center, it just the extrapolation of information through these chips per watt just blows up. It becomes very hard for the Chinese to keep up with, because they've got the H100s. They haven't got the 200s or the 300s and you go through the AMD range the same way. So that's physics. I don't know how the Chinese may have a way of besting that and keeping up. I don't know, but I think that's going to change all our lives, including the Chinese Communist Party and the American government and Australian government and everything. AI is going to arrive in a time of geopolitical contestation, if that's a word. And I think it becomes really unpredictable when it does, because we've got any number. You can line up the AI gurus on YouTube and listen to them all, and they're all saying something different. They don't really understand what's about to unfold, and that's okay. We just should recognize ourselves that if they don't understand, if they've got so many contradictory points of view, it's okay for us to hold that space open and allow for a whole bunch of different futures. So yeah, so that this is a paper on what's the reality of, I think, how the AI race is going to run, and how quickly it will run.
All right. Well, listen, my friend, you be well, and it's always a pleasure having you on the program. Come back and talk to us again.
To speak with our financial planning and wealth management team, visit us on our website, financialsensewealth.com. If you aren't already a subscriber to our weekday podcast and would like to listen to more of our content throughout the week, go to Financial Sense and hit the subscribe button.